In this part of lecture, we will get to know how the migraine occurs, and let's see the pathophysiology of the migraine. This is presynaptic neuron of serotonergic neurons. This is the postsynaptic neurons of serotonic neurons, right? The receptors which are present on the presynaptic neurons are called as autoreceptors. Most of the autoreceptors present at presynaptically, right? So these autoreceptors, one is a 5-HT1 receptor. These 5-HT1 receptors which are present on the presynaptic neuron, right? So whenever drug act onto the presynaptic 5-HT1 receptors, 5-hydroxytryptamine type 1 receptor which is present on the presynaptic neuron, whenever drug act onto these receptors will decreases or which inhibits the cyclic AMP levels, which inhibits or decreases the levels of the cyclic AMP levels. Thereby it causes the activation, right? It causes right, it causes the inhibition of the neurotransmitter release. It inhibits the neurotransmitter release. The serotonergic neuron, the neurotransmitter which is present here is 5-HT. But in case of migraine at the position, right? In case of migraine at the position, this is the presynaptic neuron. This is the presynaptic neuron, and in the on the presynaptic neuron there is a receptors which are present 5-HT1F. 5-HT1F type of receptors which are present, right? What these does, generally whenever the 5-HT gets activated, these 5 serotonergic neurons contains a special proteins, peptides, that is calcitonin gene related peptide, CGRPs. These CGRPs which are present, and this CGRP will be released, right? This CGRP whenever it released, what happens? This will act onto the blood vessels, right? After acting onto the blood vessels, so after releasing of this CGRP, this will be acting onto the blood vessels. The specialized receptors which are present on the blood vessels is calcitonin gene related peptide receptors which are present on the blood vessels, and this will activated. Whenever it gets activated, so it causes the dilation of the brain blood vessels, and this dilation causes the pain, and this pain is nothing but it is called as headache, right? And this headache is nothing but, right, this headache is nothing but migraine, right? This is called as migraine. Here how the drugs are acting, right? How the drugs are acting here. So the first one here is the drugs which are activating the, right, the drugs which are activating the 5-HT1 receptors, that is lasmiditan, right? Lasmiditan is a newly approved drug for treatment of the migraine, and there are already drugs which are present previously, those drugs which are directly acting on the receptors 5-HT1B D type of receptors, and these drugs will be acting on the 5-HT1B/D receptors. The drugs are triptans, that is sumatriptan, naritriptan, frovatriptan, zolmitriptan, L-triptan. These all triptans are will be acting on the receptors called 5-HT1B receptors. So I already told you, whenever the autoreceptors, right, 5-HT receptors, these are the 5-HT1 receptors. These 5-HT1 receptors, whenever it gets activated by some drugs, this will decreases the cyclic AMP levels. So whenever cyclic AMP levels gets decreased, this will inhibits the release of the neurotransmitter. So the same case which is happening here, these receptors, after getting activation, this receptor directly inhibits the release of the CGRP, that is calcitonin gene related peptide, that further decreases the levels, availability of the levels of the CGRP at synaptic level. So this CGRP levels will be suppressed. So no CGRP will act onto the blood vessels receptors, that is CGRP receptors. So no dilation takes place. So this will be prevented the migraine. There are directly drugs will be acting onto the CGRP ligands, right? So this is the CGRP, this will be acting onto the receptor, it is getting fitted onto the receptors, right? It is getting fitted. This is CGRP ligand which is fitted into the CGRP receptors. Now this condition is called as complementary. Complementary means which is directly getting fitted into the receptor. The ligand is getting fitted into a receptor. It is called as, this condition is called as complementary. Now what is happening? So some other drug will get acting at the CGRP ligand. It is binding to the CGRP ligand and making that complex, and that will not get attached to the CGRP receptors. Now these drugs which are newly approved for the treatment of migraine, that is fremanizumab, galcanezumab, these are the monoclonal antibodies which are acting directly onto the CGRP ligands, and that will act onto the CGRP ligand and it makes complex and further prevents the binding of CGRP with the CGRP receptors, right? And a drug which is directly acting onto the CGRP receptor, and that drug will be blocking binding of CGRP ligand with the CGRP receptors. The drug here is erinumab. This is the monoclonal antibody. Erinumab and fremanizumab, galcanezumab, these are the monoclonal antibodies and which are recently approved drugs for the treatment of migraine, right? This is how the drugs which are acting on the migraine. Further, there are some autoreceptors which are involved in the anxiety prevention. That is, this is the presynaptic neuron of the serotonergic neurons, and this is the postsynaptic neurons of serotonergic neurons. There are special receptors which are present on the presynaptic neuron, that is autoreceptors. These are 5-HT1 receptors. These 5-HT1 receptors, the drugs which are acting directly onto the 5-HT1 receptors, these are buspirone, isapirone, gipirone. These are spirone compounds. Spirone compounds, and it is specially 5-HT1A receptor. These drugs directly acting and activating the 5-HT1A receptors, and that further inhibits the release of the 5-HT from presynaptic neuron to synapse, right? This will blocks the release of the serotonin levels. right, blocks the release of the serotonin into the synapse. Thereby there is no anxiety, right, there is no anxiety caused, right, the as the serotonin level gets suppressed and that anxiety levels goes down, right. So this is how the autoreceptors are acting. Thank you.